The day Rhett got down on one knee in front of my entire family during our annual Thanksgiving gathering in Chicago was supposed to change everything for the better. Instead, it became the moment that ripped my world apart when he suddenly stood up, muttered something about needing air, and walked out the door without looking back, leaving me to explain to my shocked parents and siblings that the man I loved was actually my boyfriend and we had been hiding our gay relationship for 2 years. The turkey went cold on the table, my mother's fork clattered to her plate, and my father just stared at me with that quiet disappointment I had feared since I was 15. I stood there, ring box still in my hand, heart hammering so loud I could barely hear my own voice cracking as I tried to say the words we had rehearsed for weeks. Rhett and I met at a legal conference downtown 2 years earlier when I was presenting on sustainable architecture, and he was the sharp young lawyer from a rival firm who asked the toughest questions in the room. After the panel, he bought me coffee and we talked for 3 hours straight about everything from city planning to the pressure of living up to family expectations. He was 30 then, confident with that easy southern drawl from his Atlanta roots and eyes that made me forget every careful wall I had built around myself. We kept it quiet at first, stolen weekends in my downtown loft, late-night texts that made me smile at stoplights. Rhett always said he wanted to do it right one day, stand up in front of everyone and show the world he was proud. I believed him. Last month, when he suggested Thanksgiving with my family, I thought it was the sign I had been waiting for. My parents had suspected something for months but never asked, and my younger sister Mia kept hinting that she would love me no matter what. So we planned it down to the last detail. Rhett would propose after dessert, I would say yes, and we would finally breathe free. Instead, the front door slammed and I was left alone with the fallout. My father cleared his throat and asked if this was some kind of joke. My mother started crying quietly into her napkin while my brother Jake just shook his head and walked out to the porch. I tried to follow Rhett, but his car was already gone from the driveway. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed staring at the ring, replaying every promise he had whispered in the dark. He had sworn he would face the world with me, that the hate from strangers or even family would never break us. Now the silence in my apartment felt heavier than any argument we had ever had. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a single text from him. "Sorry. I just panicked. Give me time." I wanted to believe it, but the knot in my stomach told me time was the one thing we might not have. Work that week was a blur of client meetings and site visits, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw my father's face. The architecture firm where I had spent 8 years building my reputation suddenly felt like a stage where everyone might be watching. I threw myself into the new museum project downtown, sketching late into the night until my hand cramped, but the emptiness followed me home. Rhett called on Wednesday, sounding tired and sorry, explaining that seeing my family all at once hit him harder than he expected. His own parents back in Atlanta still thought he was dating a girl from law school, and the lie had been weighing on him. I told him I understood, but inside I wondered how many more lies we could carry. By Friday, we met at our favorite rooftop bar overlooking the river, and he held my hand under the table the way he always did when the world felt too loud. We talked about coming out slowly, maybe starting with my sister first, then his best friend from college. He promised again that he was all in, that the Thanksgiving disaster was just a bump. I wanted so badly to trust him that I leaned across the table and kissed him right there in the open air for the first time ever. A couple at the next table smiled, and one guy even raised his glass. For a moment it felt possible, like the city itself was rooting for us. But Monday morning brought the first crack in that fragile hope when my mother left a voicemail asking me to come to Sunday dinner alone. No Rhett, just me. I deleted it without answering and drove to the site instead, letting the noise of construction drown out the doubt. Rhett texted later saying he had a big case starting and would be swamped, but he loved me. I stared at those words until the screen went dark, wondering if love was enough when the rest of the world refused to make room for it. The week blurred into meetings with contractors and late-night revisions, but every spare second I found myself scrolling through old photos of us at Pride last year, hidden behind sunglasses, smiling like the future was already ours. Now that future felt shaky, and I could not shake the feeling that the proposal had forced something into the light that neither of us was truly ready to hold. Still, when Rhett showed up at my door Friday night with takeout and that crooked grin, I let him in. We ate on the couch, talking about everything except family, and for a few hours the world felt right again. He fell asleep with his head on my shoulder, and I stayed awake listening to his breathing, praying that the promise he made would be stronger than the fear that had sent him running. Little did I know the real test was only beginning, and the city lights outside my window seemed to flicker like they knew it too. The Sunday dinner invitation turned into the first real battleground none of us saw coming. I showed up alone carrying a bottle of my father's favorite wine, hoping it would soften the edges of the conversation I knew was waiting. My mother hugged me too tightly, and Mia pulled me into the kitchen whispering that she had always suspected and was proud of me. But my father barely looked up from the football game on television, his jaw tight in that way I remembered from every childhood disappointment. Over pot roast he finally spoke, asking how long I had been lying to them and whether Rhett was the reason I had drifted from the family church. I tried to explain that love did not make me less their son, but the words felt small against the weight of 30 years of expectations. Rhett called while I was driving home, his voice steady as he promised to come with me next time to face them together. He said the case was wrapping up and he wanted to make things right. We met at the lakefront the next evening, walking the path where we had first said I love you, and he took my hand openly, this time no hiding. He talked about telling his own parents soon, maybe flying to Atlanta over Christmas, and I let myself believe again. The following week at work things shifted in ways I never expected. One of the senior partners pulled me aside after a presentation and asked if everything was okay at home. Word had somehow spread through the office grapevine, probably from a cousin who worked in accounting, and now colleagues were giving me careful smiles and extra space in meetings. I kept my head down, focusing on the museum blueprints, but the isolation stung more than any outright rejection. Rhett noticed the change in me during our Thursday night dinner at the Italian place downtown. He listened while I described the awkward silences at the office, then squeezed my hand across the table and said we should go public on our own terms, maybe post a photo together on social media. The idea terrified me, but his confidence made it feel possible. That weekend we drove out to a quiet park in the suburbs and took pictures, laughing like teenagers until the sun dipped low. Posting that first image of us kissing felt like jumping off a cliff, yet the comments from friends started pouring in, mostly supportive, and the likes from strangers gave me a strange kind of courage. My sister texted immediately with heart emojis, and even Jake sent a thumbs up, though I knew he was still processing. Rhett's phone stayed quiet, and when I asked he shrugged, saying his circle was slower to warm up. We spent that night at my place talking about the future, kids through adoption, maybe a house in the suburbs, and for the first time the dream felt solid. Monday brought the first real pushback when a client pulled out of the museum project citing creative differences, but the project manager whispered it was really about the photo that had circulated in industry group chats. I confronted the partner who had asked about my home life, and he just patted my shoulder, saying times were changing, but some clients were old school. The anger that rose in me surprised even me, and I called Rhett right there in the parking garage, needing to hear his voice promise that we were stronger than this. He did better. He showed up at my office with lunch and walked me through the lobby, holding my hand so everyone could see. That small act meant more than any grand speech, and for the rest of the week the office tension eased a little. At home my mother started texting again, asking about Rhett and whether he liked her apple pie recipe. It felt like progress, tiny steps forward after years of careful silence. Rhett and I celebrated by cooking together in my kitchen, music playing low, and for a few hours the outside world disappeared. He talked about his childhood in Atlanta, the strict expectations, the fear of disappointing his father, who still used words like lifestyle choice without realizing how much they cut. I held him while he spoke and promised that when he was ready I would stand beside him the same way he had stood beside me. The next morning he left for court early, kissing me goodbye at the door and whispering that he loved me loud enough for the neighbors to hear. I went to work lighter than I had felt in weeks, sketching new ideas for the museum entrance, incorporating subtle rainbow accents that only I would notice. Life seemed to be opening up until Friday afternoon, when Rhett's name flashed on my phone and his voice came through tight with panic. His parents had seen the photo somehow, and his father was on the first flight to Chicago demanding answers. Rhett asked if I could meet them at the airport with him, and in that moment I knew the real storm was just arriving. I said yes without hesitation, because that was what love meant, or at least what I thought it meant. Driving to O'Hare I rehearsed calm explanations, but my hands shook on the wheel. Rhett was waiting at arrivals, looking pale, and when his parents stepped off the plane his mother hugged him first, then turned to me with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. His father shook my hand firmly, but the grip said everything his words left unsaid. We drove to a hotel in silence, and I wondered how many more promises we would have to test before the world finally let us breathe. The hotel lobby felt too bright, too loud, as Rhett's father launched into the speech I had dreaded since the day we met. He spoke about tradition, legacy, and the family name, while Rhett sat beside me, gripping my knee under the table so hard I knew he was fighting not to run again. His mother kept glancing between us, her eyes soft but confused, asking gentle questions about how we met and whether I was the reason her son had stopped calling home every Sunday. I answered honestly because hiding had already cost us too much, but every word seemed to land like a stone in still water. Rhett tried to defend us, saying he was happy for the first time in years, but his father just shook his head and suggested they talk alone, man to man. I waited in the lobby watching strangers rush past with their suitcases, feeling suddenly exposed in a way I had never felt before. When Rhett finally emerged an hour later, his eyes were red, but he smiled and said it went better than expected. We drove back to my place in silence, and once inside he pulled me close, whispering that nothing would change us. I wanted to believe him, so I cooked pasta and we watched a movie like any normal couple, but the tension lingered in the air between us. The next morning his parents insisted on brunch at a downtown cafe, and the conversation turned to church attendance and future grandchildren. I sat quietly while Rhett deflected, promising nothing concrete, but his mother kept looking at me with a mix of pity and hope that made my stomach turn. Back at the apartment, Rhett apologized for the pressure, saying his father would come around once he saw how serious we were. That week at work, the museum client returned with new demands, and I buried myself in revisions, staying late every night. Rhett texted updates from the hotel where his parents were still staying, and on Wednesday he asked me to join them for dinner again. This time his father was quieter, watching me across the table like he was measuring my worth against some invisible checklist. After dessert he pulled Rhett aside again, and when they returned Rhett looked exhausted but determined. He told me later that his father had offered him a partnership in the family firm back in Atlanta if he came home and left Chicago behind. The offer hung between us like a threat, and I asked him straight out what he wanted. Rhett kissed me and said Chicago was home now because I was here. The words should have filled me with relief, but something in his voice felt rehearsed, and I pushed the doubt down deep. Friday brought a different kind of storm when my brother Jake showed up unannounced at my office wanting to talk. We walked to a nearby park, and he admitted he had been angry at first, but Mia had talked sense into him. He even asked about Rhett and whether we were thinking about marriage. The conversation felt like a small victory until Jake mentioned that Dad was struggling more than he let on and maybe a family counseling session could help. I promised to think about it and hugged him before he left, feeling lighter than I had in days. That night Rhett and I celebrated with wine on the rooftop, talking about telling his parents we were staying in Chicago no matter what. He held me close under the stars, and for the first time since Thanksgiving the future seemed within reach. Saturday morning started with hope until Rhett's phone rang during breakfast and his father's voice carried through the speaker loud enough for me to hear every word. The conversation turned heated quickly, with accusations flying about choices and disappointment, and when Rhett hung up he paced the kitchen saying he needed space to think. I gave him the afternoon alone working on sketches at the dining table, but when evening came and he still had not returned, my worry turned sharp. He finally texted saying he was with his parents sorting things out and would be home late. I waited up until 2 in the morning, replaying every promise he had made, wondering if the pressure was finally cracking him. When he slipped into bed at 3, he smelled like hotel soap and whiskey and mumbled that everything would be fine. I held him while he slept, but sleep would not come for me. Sunday brunch with his parents was cancelled at the last minute, and Rhett suggested we spend the day at the zoo instead, just the two of us. We walked hand in hand, watching the animals and laughing at the penguins until the normalcy felt almost real again. On the drive home he told me his father had booked a return flight for Tuesday and that the worst was over. I wanted to celebrate, but the knot in my chest refused to loosen. Monday at work brought another surprise when the senior partner called me into his office and offered me lead designer on a new community center project, specifically because of my fresh perspective. The validation felt good, but when I told Rhett over lunch, he seemed distracted, checking his phone every few minutes. That evening his parents invited us to their hotel for a farewell dinner, and the atmosphere was tense but civil. His father even shook my hand at the end and said he hoped I would visit Atlanta someday. As we drove away, Rhett exhaled like he had been holding his breath for days and thanked me for standing by him. We made love that night, slow and tender, and I let myself believe the storm had passed. Tuesday morning I woke to an empty bed and a note on the pillow saying Rhett had gone to the airport to see his parents off and would be back by lunch. I made coffee and opened my laptop, ready to tackle the new project, but the hours ticked by and his phone went straight to voicemail. By 3 o'clock worry had turned to fear, and when I called the hotel they said the room had been checked out that morning. The text came at 4, simple and devastating. I need time to figure out who I am without all this pressure. Please don't hate me. I stared at the screen until the words blurred and the apartment that had felt like home suddenly felt like a cage. The man who had promised to overcome everything with me had walked away again, and this time I was not sure he was coming back. The silence after Rhett's text stretched into days that blurred together like gray paint on a canvas. I called in sick to work for the first time in years, telling the partner I had a family emergency, which was not entirely a lie. My apartment felt too big, too quiet, and every corner held memories of him laughing at my terrible cooking or stealing the last slice of pizza. I scrolled through our old messages, reading the promises he had typed late at night, and each one cut deeper than the last. My sister Mia showed up on Thursday with groceries and a fierce hug, refusing to leave until I ate something real. She listened while I poured out the story, and when I finished she said the words I needed to hear, that his leaving said more about his fear than about my worth. We talked late into the night, and she convinced me to see a counselor at the LGBTQ center downtown. The first session felt raw and exposing, but the therapist, a kind woman named Dr. Ellis, helped me name the panic that had been building since Thanksgiving. Work became my anchor, the new community center project demanding every ounce of focus I could give. I poured my heart into the designs, adding open gathering spaces and bright colors that symbolized belonging. The team noticed my intensity, but no one asked questions, and for that I was grateful. Rhett's number stayed blocked after the third unanswered call, and the emptiness shifted from sharp pain to a dull ache that followed me everywhere. My father reached out unexpectedly on a Sunday, inviting me to watch the game alone, no pressure. We sat in awkward silence at first, but by halftime he cleared his throat and said he was sorry for how he had reacted. It was not forgiveness exactly, but it was a start, and I left that afternoon feeling like one small piece of my world had steadied. Friends from college started checking in after Mia spread the word, and their support felt like a safety net I had never known I needed. One night we gathered at a bar downtown, and for the first time I told the full story without editing out the parts that made me look foolish. They listened without judgment, and when I finished someone raised a toast to new beginnings. The laughter that followed felt healing, even if it did not erase the hole Rhett had left. Weeks turned into a month, and the community center plans won approval from the city council with praise for the inclusive design. The senior partner took me to lunch to celebrate and mentioned a possible promotion if I kept delivering. Success tasted bittersweet without anyone to share it with, but I kept moving forward because stopping meant facing the questions I was not ready to answer. Rhett's social media stayed silent, no new posts, no stories, and I told myself that was for the best. Then one Tuesday afternoon my phone buzzed with an unknown number, and when I answered, Rhett's voice came through hesitant and tired. He was back in Atlanta staying with his parents, trying to sort through the mess he had made. He said he missed me every day, but the pressure from his family and the fear of losing everything he had worked for had been too much. I listened without interrupting, letting him talk until he asked if there was any chance we could try again. The question hung in the air, and for the first time I realized I was no longer the same man who had waited by the door with his heart in his hands. I told him I needed time now that the tables had turned, and when I hung up the quiet in my apartment felt different, somehow stronger. Dr. Ellis helped me unpack that call over the next session, pointing out how much I had grown in just a few weeks. I started running along the lakefront every morning, the rhythm of my feet on pavement matching the steady beat of a heart learning to stand alone. My mother invited me to dinner again, this time with Mia and Jake, and the conversation flowed easier than it had in years. They asked about the community center and even suggested Rhett's name once, but let it drop when I changed the subject. Life was rebuilding itself piece by piece, and though the scar remained, it no longer defined every day. The promotion came through at the end of the month with a new office and a team reporting to me. I stood in the empty space after everyone left and allowed myself one quiet moment of pride. That night I cooked dinner for myself, played music loud, and danced alone in the kitchen, something I had never done before. The freedom tasted sweet, even if loneliness still lingered at the edges. Rhett texted the next day asking if we could meet when he came to Chicago for a court date in 2 weeks. I stared at the message for a long time before typing a single word. Maybe. The uncertainty felt like power, and for the first time since he walked out I slept through the night without dreaming of what we had lost. The 2 weeks before Rhett's court date passed in a whirlwind of meetings and site visits that left little room for overthinking. I threw myself into finalizing the community center renderings, adding community input from local LGBTQ youth groups who had reached out after hearing about the project. Their stories mirrored pieces of my own, and listening to them reminded me why I had chosen this career in the first place. Mia helped me pick out a new suit for the promotion celebration, and when I told her about Rhett's upcoming visit, she simply said to trust my gut. The night before he arrived, I sat on the rooftop replaying our last conversation and realized the man I had become no longer needed his approval to feel whole. He texted when his plane landed asking if I was still open to meeting, and I suggested the same park where we had taken our first public photo. The spring air carried the scent of blooming lilacs, and when he walked toward me in jeans and a faded hoodie, he looked smaller, somehow less like the confident lawyer who had once swept me off my feet. We sat on a bench, and he started talking, immediately apologizing for the silence, the abandonment, the broken promises. He said Atlanta had been a pressure cooker of expectations, and that leaving me had been the only way he knew to survive it. I listened, letting the words wash over me until he reached for my hand. The touch felt familiar yet distant, and when he asked if we could start over, I pulled back gently. The conversation turned honest in a way it never had before, with me explaining how his leaving had forced me to face parts of myself I had ignored. He nodded, tears in his eyes, admitting that his fear of losing his family had made him choose the easier path, even though it cost him the best thing in his life. We walked the path in silence after that, and when we reached the parking lot, he hugged me one last time, whispering that he would always love me. I watched him drive away, feeling the finality settle in my chest like a door closing softly. The next morning at work, the team surprised me with a cake for the promotion, and their cheers filled the conference room with a warmth I had not felt in months. That afternoon I met with the youth group again, listening to their dreams for the center and promising to make the space truly theirs. Their gratitude reminded me that my story was bigger than one failed relationship. My father called that evening to congratulate me on the promotion, and for the first time we talked about Rhett without anger. He admitted he had been wrong to judge so quickly, and that seeing me succeed had changed his perspective. The conversation ended with an invitation to the family cabin over the 4th of July, and I accepted, feeling another piece of the puzzle click into place. Rhett sent a text the following week saying he had taken a job in Atlanta permanently, and that he hoped I would find the happiness I deserved. I read it twice, then deleted the thread, closing the chapter for good. The summer stretched ahead with new projects and weekend trips with friends that filled the calendar with laughter and possibility. One Saturday, Mia dragged me to a Pride planning meeting downtown, and before I knew it, I was volunteering to design the main stage. The work felt meaningful, and the community that welcomed me gave me a sense of belonging I had never experienced before. Dr. Ellis noticed the change in our sessions, saying I had moved from surviving to thriving, and for the first time I believed her. The 4th of July at the cabin brought the whole family together, and around the campfire my father raised a toast to new beginnings. I smiled, feeling the weight of the past lift a little more. Back in the city, the community center groundbreaking ceremony drew a crowd, and when I stepped to the podium to speak, the words came easily. I talked about inclusion and second chances without mentioning Rhett by name, yet everyone who knew the story understood. The applause that followed felt like validation, not just for the building but for the man I had become. That night, alone in my apartment, I opened the ring box one last time, stared at the simple band inside, and then closed it for good, placing it in the back of a drawer. The future stretched ahead, bright and uncharted, and for the first time I was ready to walk into it on my own terms. The groundbreaking ceremony marked more than the start of construction. It marked the beginning of a new chapter one had written without waiting for anyone else's approval. The months that followed brought steady progress on the center, with ribbon cuttings and youth programs that filled the space with laughter and possibility. I mentored a group of young designers from the local college, sharing everything I had learned about turning pain into purpose. Their questions reminded me daily that growth was not linear but worth every stumble. My family attended the official opening in September, and my father stood beside me as the mayor cut the ribbon, his hand resting briefly on my shoulder in silent support. Mia and Jake helped serve cake to the crowd, and for the first time in years, the four of us felt like a team again. Work continued to flourish, with the promotion leading to bigger projects across the city, and I found myself traveling to conferences where I spoke openly about inclusive design. At one event in New York, I met other architects living their truths, and their stories wove into my own, strengthening the foundation I had built. Back home, the rooftop became my sanctuary, where I drank coffee at sunrise, planning the next phase of my life. Friends noticed the change, calling me lighter somehow, and I realized they were right. The ache of Rhett's absence had softened into a lesson rather than a wound, and I no longer checked my phone hoping for messages that would never come. Thanksgiving arrived again, this time at my parents' house with a full table and no secrets hanging in the air. We laughed about old memories, and when conversation turned to relationships, I shared that I was dating myself for now, and that felt enough. My mother smiled with understanding and passed the pie without pressing further. The holiday weekend ended with a long walk along the lake where I scattered the last of the doubts that had lingered since that fateful proposal. Winter brought fresh snow and new opportunities, including a collaboration with the city on affordable housing that incorporated community feedback at every step. I volunteered more at the center, teaching design workshops and watching young people discover their voices. One evening after a session, a young man named Alex approached me saying my story had given him courage to come out to his family. His words stayed with me long after he left, reminding me that healing was never just personal. Christmas came quietly with a small gathering at Mia's apartment, and when she asked if I was happy, I answered honestly that I was learning to be. The new year started with a clean slate and a resolution to travel more. I booked a solo trip to San Francisco for a design conference and spent evenings walking the hills, letting the ocean air clear the last remnants of old pain. On the flight home, I sketched ideas for a new project, a public garden dedicated to resilience, and when the plane touched down in Chicago, I felt ready for whatever came next. Spring returned with blooming parks and renewed energy. The community center hosted its first Pride event, and I stood on the stage I had designed, watching families cheer for their loved ones. In that moment, every sacrifice, every tear, every step forward felt worth it. Life had not followed the script I once imagined, but it had given me something better: authenticity and strength I never knew I possessed. Looking back at the man who once waited by the door for a promise that never held, I felt only gratitude for the journey that led me here. The city lights still twinkled beyond my window, but now they reflected a future I had built with my own hands. And as the year turned full circle, I realized the greatest love story was the one I was living with myself every single day. Was it true that love can conquer all prejudice, or is it sometimes just a beautiful lie we tell ourselves? True or false?